Please join me in welcoming Kate.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming along. And I'd like to just thank the Royal Australian Historical Society for running this series of events and giving us a chance to present our work to you. This research started because I was interested in the life and career of John Lucas. Lucas had a 40-year parliamentary career in New South Wales during the 19th century, the first 20 years in the Assembly and the last 20 years in the Legislative Council. His reputation was that of a fiercely independent politician. So I was interested to see what level of influence a fiercely independent politician had in the days before there were any official political parties in New South Wales. When I started researching Lucas's political career to write his biography, I found what could be termed as the black hole of colonial political history. Apart from the big names, guys like Henry Parkes, John Robertson, Charles Cowper and James Martin, there's been very little historical research done on individual politicians. The occasional substantial biography of other politicians, who are usually the less well-remembered leaders, sit in dusty isolation on library shelves. Those biographers encountered the same difficulty that I did, a dearth of detailed, comparative or substantial work to build on. The excellent series of works that were produced for the sesquicentenary of responsible government in New South Wales in 2006, many of which I found very valuable for my research, by the nature of their brief looked more at broad themes than individual careers. The notable exception, of course, being the volumes on premiers and governors, which continues this theme of the very prominent politicians who are being researched. I was, however, absolutely fascinated by the widely held view in those works that the independent politicians were more trouble than the politicians who regularly changed factional allegiance. The idea of independent politicians in the 19th century needs a little bit of context. The most significant work done on political agency within the New South Wales Parliament during this period is Peter Loveday and Alan Martin's 1966 book, Parliament, Factions and Parties. This book was an amalgamation of their respective PhD theses, and it essentially explained how the faction system worked, from the introduction of responsible government in 1856 through to the development of political parties as we recognise them today, which started to emerge in the early 1890s. I've not been able to locate any scholarship published before or since that book that established categorically the existence of these factions. However, Loveday and Martin accepted their existence and advanced a framework in which they understood the factional system to work, with some minor variations across that 35-year period. I remain unconvinced by their argument, but that's a discussion for another time. Today I want to talk about the politicians who were classified as being independent between 1860 and 1872. Now, this classification actually comes from Peter Loveday's 1962 PhD thesis called The Development of Parliamentary Government in New South Wales. The book that they wrote, that they co-authored, didn't actually spell out any of the factions within there, didn't actually tell you who made those up. But in Peter Loveday's thesis, he does tell you for that time period. Those years of 1860 to 1872 encompass the 4th, 5th and 6th parliaments, so there's a discrete cohort of politicians. There are a surprising number of politicians who were identified as being independent throughout that period. I expected to find 5 guys sitting on the crossbench, but there were far more of them than that. 55 were clearly identified as independent or providing only shaky support to a faction, and approximately another 20 were classified as independent for part of their parliamentary career. Out of those, only 10 men were in Parliament for most or all of that 12-year period. And so those 10 men form the basis for my research as I unpick what independence meant for a politician in the political and parliamentary frameworks of the mid-19th century. I'm also interested in why those men have been so significantly distinguished from the politicians that Loveday see as a member of factions. The 10 politicians who form the core of my research and the 10 politicians who were independent for most of that 12-year period. So I've delivered, at least in part, on the title of my paper. But of course, we're interested in far more than their names. We're interested in the deeper sense of who they were. Their individual biographies are readily available, a little bit scant, but readily available. So I'm starting with a collective biography approach to see if it gives us any significant conclusions that we can draw. For any of this to be relevant, the research needs to be contextualised within the broader political structure of the time. To date, I've been working on the analysis for the Fourth Parliament, so 1860 to 1864, and that's what will form the basis for the paper. There are some similarities common to most of these men, but interestingly, I haven't found one characteristic that's common to all of them, except that Loveday classified them as independent. They weren't the only ones who were independent in the Fourth Parliament. 18 men, or 24%, were classified as independent by Loveday, and another 11%, or 11 men, or 15%, were classified as giving shaky support to a factional leader. Now, one of the issues that I can't reconcile with Loveday and Martin's argument is the idea that some politicians can be seen to be giving shaky support to a leader and still be counted as part of that faction. If politicians could exercise enough personal discretion to decide whether or not to support a particular leader or on which issues they would do so, to me that's exercising independent thought and independent choices. Similarly, Loveday actually allocates Henry Parkes into a faction of one, all by himself, which is clearly an example of his later influence being projected backwards in time, because he wasn't exercising anywhere near that kind of influence in this time period. So I've reclassified some of Loveday's politicians, the ones considered to be giving shaky support to leaders, as independent. And as a result, approximately 40% of politicians in the Parliament were effectively acting independently, which makes them the biggest single group. So this gives you an idea of Loveday's factional groupings with my reclassification of some men as independent rather than as giving factional support. So the list of independents is on the left, and of the other two factions, James Martin has 14 men, including himself, and the faction jointly led by Charles Cowper and John Robertson have 24 men, including themselves. And it's also very interesting in terms of their argument on factions that Robertson and Cowper are seen to lead a faction jointly, when the idea of factions is that they were actually built around a personality in exchange for favour or patronage. So it's interesting that Loveday could see two guys actually sharing that role. At this point in colonial politics, support in large numbers was actually only required to pass legislation. Ministries were formed when the governor approached a politician who appeared to enjoy strong support in the Legislative Assembly and invited them to form a ministry. If that politician could find enough people to fill those positions, he became Premier. A Premier considered themselves defeated if they did not have the support in the Assembly to pass legislation, but that support didn't have to be found in the same politicians every time. So to come back to the core research group of 10 politicians, 80% of them were native born, compared with 30% of the Fourth Parliament as a whole. Interestingly, 30% of the whole Parliament were native born, and they actually make up the largest national group, followed by the English at 28% and the Irish at 21%. There's certainly an argument to be made that you could combine the English and Irish together and call them a United Kingdom contingent and declare them as being the dominant group. But in the 1860s, the English and the Irish considered themselves to be at least as separate from each other as each did from the native born, so it seems polite to respect the distinction that they would have observed. There's clearly a few native born in each of the Martin and Cowper-Robertson factions, but the majority of them are classified as independent. As 70% of the independents that my research focuses on had either convict ancestry or a convict in the family. James Hannell, John Lackey, George Lord, John Lucas, James Ryan and Samuel Terry were either the sons or grandsons of a convict, and in some cases more than one. For Saul Samuel, the convict was his uncle, who offered Saul and his mother Lydia a home in Sydney after Saul's father died in England. David Buchanan claimed to have narrowly escaped imprisonment for Chartist activity before he left Edinburgh, but whether that would give him any sense of community with the descendants of convicts is not clear. The political stance that's implied may well have endeared him to the native born. You can see from the diagram that there are a few other politicians with convict ancestry here, and this particular part of the analysis remains a work in progress because I haven't dug into the past of all of the politicians yet, and for some of them the convict ancestry is obscured far more strongly than it is for others. There's an extensive historiography that focuses on the additional challenges experienced by both native-born and those of convict descent as they built their lives in the Australian colonies, but I want to briefly discuss just two of them. John Maloney's book, The Native Born, traces the social development of New South Wales from 1788 through to the 1840s. Maloney argues that anyone born in the colonies to the lower classes, or the middle class, which was just starting to emerge towards the end of that period, faced extensive discrimination on the basis of their birth alone. A discrimination that those who were native born but with upper class immigrant parents often escaped by virtue of money or breeding or both. Babette Smith articulates a contrary view in Australia's Birth Stain, where she contends that both Australian birth and convict ancestry were badges of pride until the anti-transportation movement of the 1840s. One thing they agree on is the feeling of personal independence and self-sufficiency that the native-born shared. But this would seem to be contradicted by Richard Driver's complaint in 1859 that the natives of this country had never had a fair share of representation either in the government or in patronage, and that they felt disadvantaged by this exclusion. So part of the future research will be to see whether any of these particular 10 guys had any experience with that and had any reason to feel aggrieved. To return again to the core research group, there's no discernible pattern to be seen in the committee activities of this group. And this is where I expected to see them grouped together in committees that focused on issues particularly important to the native-born. But the pattern, or rather the lack of a pattern, of committee representation doesn't support that. Parliamentary committees during this period were usually formed by a politician calling for one and then suggesting who else might participate. So there was certainly the opportunity for them to have grouped together if they chose to do so. And the fact that they didn't suggests that they didn't feel any need to group together under those issues. And I have a feeling that may be significant in terms of how we understand public policy and agenda setting in the mid-19th century. When the electorates that each of these politicians represented are plotted onto a map, there's one interesting factor. The group of 5 electorates that are sitting there central west New South Wales may actually indicate some cluster of independent political activity. The other 5 electorates are geographically distant from each other and from that cluster. But those 5 electorates require some further investigation to see whether there's anything significant happening in that area at that time, which might explain a preference for political representatives with a clearly charted independent stance on policy and issues. Interestingly, in the electorates where 2 members were returned, the voters appeared to have no difficulty in returning both an independent and a politician who Loveday classified as being part of a faction. In the election of December 1860, John Lackey and James Burns were both returned for Parramatta, with Burns being classified as part of James Martin's faction. Lackey received 39% of the vote, Burns received 34%. In the same election, John Lucas and Edward Raper, who was also considered to be part of Martin's faction, were returned for the seat of Canterbury. Lucas received 44% of the vote and Raper 31%. In both cases, the independent candidate received more votes than the other candidate returned for that electorate. Whether or not this is significant is obviously an area for future research, including whether the voters were actually aware of any potential factional allegiance when they cast their vote. Some scholars have placed considerable emphasis on sectarian divisions in colonial New South Wales society, so it's worth examining very briefly here. There was quite a diversity of religious denominations present. Apart from Saul Samuel, who was one of 3 men of Jewish faith, and David Buchanan, who was one of 7 Presbyterians, 80% of the group for this study identified as belonging to the Church of England, along with 35 of their fellow parliamentarians. Although Church of England affiliation was the largest among the politicians of the 4th Parliament as a whole at 43%, it can't really be considered overwhelmingly dominant. Religious affiliation does not seem to have been a factor in determining factional groups at all, given that each of the religious denominations are reasonably well represented among the different groups. 41% of the 4th Parliament were elected for the first time in the 1860 election. In this diagram, the squares indicate first time in Parliament. This 41% is essentially mirrored by the group of 10 independents, of whom 50% were elected for the first time in the 1860 general election. However, John Lucas had been first returned to Parliament in a by-election of February that year, so he could therefore be considered a relatively inexperienced politician. The remaining 4 from the core research group could be considered relatively experienced politicians by the standards of colonial New South Wales, so it's therefore difficult to discern any meaningful pattern here either. Occupation also does not appear to have been a factor. For the purposes of this discussion, I've classified the occupations of the politicians into relatively broad but easily identifiable groups. Pastoralists and graziers, the lawyers, businessmen, so people in trade or professions, and the other sources of income, so either men who are independently wealthy, teachers, and those for whom there doesn't seem to be an identifiable income source. The absence of clear patterns that distinguish independent politicians generally, and this cohort of 10 in particular, is interesting in itself. It's possible that being native born or having convict ancestry was more significant for this cohort of politicians than for other politicians who also meet that criteria. It's also possible that there's something else in their education, background, work experience or life experience that prompted them to behave in a way that distinguished them as independent. It's equally possible that they were all independent for different reasons. Not all of these politicians were considered independent by Loveday for the whole 12-year period that my research is examining. Some were later classified as belonging to the Cowper-Robertson faction or the Martin faction, and I'll be looking further at how and why those transitions might have occurred. So at this point in my research, the question of who were the independent politicians from 1860 to 1872 remains somewhat unanswered. Beyond their identification and some initial detail, I probably know more about who they were not than who they were. In Loveday and Martin's framework, they were the men who had the courage of their own convictions, did not exchange their support for favours or patronage, and were not dazzled by strong personalities. Contrary to what might be expected, they did not seem to feel the need to group together to advance the cause of the native born or any other issues through committee work, and they appear to share no specific allegiance through religious affiliation, occupation, or parliamentary experience or inexperience. They defy attempts to describe them accurately at a generalised level, which suggests that there is a deeper and more interesting story here. Thank you.
Now, questions. Anyone's got some questions? I have one. What were you were very careful not to say, but what were the divisions of those who were aligned? They obviously weren't political parties as we know them today, but what were they?
Loveday and Martin's theory is that the factions formed around really strong personalities, and that it was often done in exchange for favours or patronage. My problem with that is that it basically writes off the rest of the parliament as being sheep who would go where they were told and follow whatever they were told in exchange for some kind of outcome. You know, whether the idea is that they're roads and bridges politicians and they wanted that for their electorate, or they wanted their son to get into the public service or whatever. So that was sort of my first real objection to the exercise. And then when I actually sort of match these guys, you can see that they've concentrated on these factions and they're ignoring 40% of the parliament that are basically behaving independently. Admittedly, when they break the factions up, there are far more guys in the factions because they've got this idea of shaky support, which I just can't reconcile for myself.
I've got questions about John Robertson, but I won't. Yeah, Susan.
So why did you choose that particular 12-year period?
I chose it because 1860 is the first year that John Lucas goes into Parliament, and he was my first entry into the process. But the fourth Parliament's actually the first stable Parliament after responsible government. By the time they get to the 1860 election, they'd had 4 elections in 4 years. They'd had numerous by-elections as well, as people sort of decided to stand for Parliament, decided it was too hard and bailed out, and then had to replace them. So it was the first Parliament. The fourth one's actually the first Parliament that sits for the entire period, which is interesting in terms of there's a new governor that comes in 1861, Sir John Young, and he didn't like dissolutions. So whether he made them play nice and get along, or whether they managed to work it out for themselves, is still something I'm trying to come to a landing on. But it's the first stable one, and then you've got that sort of neat, around the early 1870s, it does start to get a little bit more unstable again. They start to roll governments a little bit more quickly.
Any more questions?
When did that division of free trade, and I forgot what the other one was called?
Free trade and protectionists.
When did that start? Did that start in this period? Or?
There's certainly arguments for and against happening in this period, but it doesn't really cause the kind of divide that it causes towards the end of the 1800s. And there seems to be, that's sort of getting outside of the period where I'm really researching, but my sense is that that's often regarded as the reason, or one of the main catalysts for the development of political parties, is that people sort of split along those lines. But I think that also happens because there's an economic depression at the end of the 1880s and the early 1890s. And we see it happen in the United States as well, that there's a real solidification of ideology when they're under financial pressure. And that's where you start to see these really entrenched political parties come through.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Kate for a fantastic paper. Thank you very much.